So I started off making this build inspired by Joseph's Vaal Molten Shell builds. With the mirroring of jewelry this league, I figured I'd try to make this build work again. I'll start off by saying that I personally do not recommend replicating this build unless you're a masochist. It is pretty bad. So this is a level 76 Inquisitor named Molten Shell's Revenge. I would say that level 76 is kind of the baseline level that you want to be to even have the build function. I went into it earlier than this, and it was pretty miserable. So the idea around this build was to get Vaal Molten Shell to have 0 soul gain prevention. And to accomplish this, we're using a mirrored amulet with 55% reduced Vaal skill effect duration. And it's anointed with windows of opportunity for an additional 15%. So that gets us 70%. And then we're using the Triumvirate Authority for an additional 30% reduction, which nets us the 100%. And ideally, to get the most uses, you want to have a Triumvirate with 30% less souls per use, and the other mod doesn't really matter. Those are the only two that you really want. To get functionality or quality of life, because we want to have a cast when damage taken loop just so we can actually generate damage with the Molten Shell. Since we can't use the Eye of Innocence because our amulet slot is taken up, and since we're stacking armor, we can't use other methods. So we're using the Replica Tool Fall loop, which is every time you reach maximum power charges, you lose all the power charges and you take 500 cold damage. And to survive this is where a lot of the uniques come in. So you have the Eternal Apple to generate, lose all of your endurance charges upon reaching maximum endurance charges. And then you have Kingsguard to gain your 100 life. It's just whenever you lose your endurance charges. It's a standard Replica Tool Fall loop. But since we can't have a 100% chance of gaining an endurance charge, it is not very good for sustaining your life pool. It's not good enough. So to go around this, we are an Inquisitor. That's part of it. So you have Sanctuary, which creates consecrated ground, and Pious Path, the increased effect. And the second portion of trying to live through it is using a Life Leech support on our main cast when damage taken loop, and a Worm's Molt with close to 1000% increased life recovery from Leech. This I found, just having these two, the Life Leech and the Worm's Molt, was a huge quality of life for sustaining yourself. I noticed that when I didn't have those two on, then it got a little sketchy at times, especially once you had enough mobs hitting you. This was pretty much the only way to really sustain your life. And the rest of the items is pretty much just to get damage. So that we're using Crown of the Tyrant because it is a good life pool, and it has minus 10% all resistances. You can use a Warlord Helm, but it's more costly to even get even close to this. This is kind of the best in slot in general, unless you really need links, but you don't really with this build. Then we have Legacy of Fury for the Scorched Ground, and it also helps with clear because of the exploding and dealing fire damage, or burning damage. And you just want to try to get the 50% increased Scorch effect is the main thing. Otherwise, it really doesn't matter about those boots. And thirdly, we're using a rare pair of gloves that has the Eater of Worlds implicit for inflicting fire damage on hit, applies exposure, or applies exposure on hit. Anyways, and the other implicit doesn't really matter because you can't scale reflected damage. So that mod is kind of worthless. Otherwise, you can just hit it with a couple essences. Just really generic pair of gloves. To cap our resistances, we're using a bismuth flask with just resistances on it. And the other two... Oh, and this flask is pretty much a must. Is the 53% reduced effect of shock on you. I'm using Soul of Garukhan, which is 60% reduced effect of shock on you. If you don't have reduced shock effect and you get shocked, the tool fall damage will basically kill you, just because it's doing so much. So ideally you want to have some form of reduced shock effect or you will die. This one isn't necessary if you do have this flask. If you don't have this... If you don't have this flask, though, you need to have... We'll try to make the passive section really short. Pretty much the only things that you really need for your ascendancy is you're just taking Righteous Providence for the strength and intelligence, the Augury of Penitence so that nearby enemies take 16% increase elemental damage, pretty much one of the only ways to actually scale Molten Shell damage. And then you want Sanctuary and Pious Path, and that's one of the main functions of how we're living. Pretty much all of the jewels you want to have are Grand Spectrum of +1 minimum endurance charge and +1 minimum power charges. That's pretty much making the build function right there. For the loops, you want to have a Brutal Restraint with Balbala just for flask charge upkeep, and you want a Brute Force solution so you have enough intelligence to even equip the Replica Tool Fall. You want a Fluid Motion so that you even have enough dexterity to use Grace, and then you want to have a Watcher's Eye with gain life on hit while affected by Vitality. The only other nodes that you really need are Inexorable for the 25% chance to gain an endurance charge when you're hit. That's how you're creating that endurance charge loop. And the Iron Reflexes, as well as Battle Ruse, so that you recoup 10% of the damage you take as mana, because it's one of the ways that we're upkeeping our mana on top of having... another big part of the amulet is non-channeling skills have -16 to total mana cost. With the changes to cast when damage taken loops, it's one of the only ways to really sustain our mana. Alright. So taking a look at links for this build, what we have set up for the main cast when damage taken loop is Bladefall, Firestorm, Voltaxic Burst, Life Leech, Cast when damage taken, and Blade Blast. And then you have, if you're bossing, you would have another cast when damage taken of just another Bladefall. We have a self-cast Bladefall, which is linked with Flammability, Hex Touch support, and Combustion, just to increase our damage a little further. Finally, the rest of them are just kind of your auras. So you have Grace, Vitality, Determination. Clarity's not necessary at all. I don't use it. And then you have Defiance Banner. For mobility, you just have Flame Dash, and if you're mapping, you'd swap out the cast when single link cast when damage taken loop, just have greater mobility. And finally, your Eternal Apple will have Ancestor Cry for the increased armor per 5 power, the Enduring Cry for extra survivability and generation of endurance charges, and Infernal Cry to cover your enemies in ash to further increase the damage that you deal. My final notes for this is there seems to be a couple issues with Vaal Molten Shell. One of the things that I noticed was if you're using regular Molten Shell and you have it active and you pop Vaal Molten Shell, there's a small buffer time where it actually doesn't like register that you have a guard skill in effect, and so you'll have the buff up here, but it won't actually absorb any damage, and you're depending on how many mobs you have on you and how many things you're hitting with your loops, you will take all that damage up front and you'll be unguarded for about a quarter or half a second before your newly applied Vaal Molten Shell will absorb the damage. It's an easy way to die sometimes, and another one of the issues is, this is just with Molten Shell itself, you have to pretty much be on top of the enemy. If you're not on top of the enemy when your Vaal Molten Shell or your regular Molten Shell pops, you're not going to do any damage. And it feels really bad, especially for whatever, again, this is a little weird, but with Vaal Molten Shell, it applies the damage every second. It accumulates all the damage that is taken, and it reflects it every second in an AoE around you. But with this setup, it only lasts 2.7 seconds. Interestingly enough, it still counts the third one but applies it twice, because it does the second tick and it pops. So it's basically a double hit for your third hit. But it feels really bad when you miss that third big hit, especially because the amount of damage that you even have normally is so minimal. You want to try to get as much damage as possible out, and if you miss that third one, it's bad. It's really, really bad. Finally, I just wanted to say thank you for watching my video. I know it's quite lengthy, so I hope that you skipped around to the spots that you were actually interested in seeing. And I'm ending this video with some clips of mapping and some boss fights. So, just to give you an idea of what you would maybe experience with this build, I did try one Black Star fight, and it did so poorly that there's no footage of it. Alright, well, maybe see you in the next League Exiles. Good luck.